Наоборот, просто. У нас идет синяник, синяник. Царский русский. Сапог. Ладно, делай. Кто здесь? Чем будешь, Флорида? Флорида будешь? Нет, не будешь Флорида. Будешь Флорида. Ну ты чё? Встаёшь много как раз. Нормальной дерзости. Нормально, да, это из-за чего будет это значит. Будет из-за чего, значит, не будет. Ну на, вот это из-за этой штуки. Из-за вот этого. Ага. Да, много всего. Ты уверен, что это много всего? Штучку-дрючку ты увидели уже все? Ты уверен, что не видели штучку-дрючку, да? Покажи, ты увидел. Ну вот нам, да. Заштрафуют тебя, да, за что ты переказываешь это с ногами. А зачем нужен Facebook тогда? Объясняй мне, пожалуйста. Книга ох, яйца эмоции. Яйца деньги. Дело яйца боится. Столько времени, все ни о чем. Денег есть, нет, не яйца. На яйцовник. А еще? Еще как чего? Ничего. Всего-то ничего, как чей там ведет интернет даже. А, нарушение прав автора.
Lends itself so well to this game. And to make things even better, I was already planning to add one of those anyway. So, with everything coming up Millhouse, I got to work while on stream that day.
произведение, вы в каком клипе? О чем будете? Конкретно будете клип?
Молодыжа из Мордора, молодыжка, злой, добрый, братишка из Мордора. Надо уже, не могу.
Все очень кругло.
Кричи, 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 кричи! Я ладно тебе. Я никому не нужен, мне вообще не берет. Я реально тебе говорю, я вообще всем здесь написал, бля. Они вообще все тупые просто. Ладно, удмуртия,
Наоборот, не надо, мне писал, а потом пожелал, говорит, понимаете, это... Нет, наоборот. Там ничего нету, потому что... Нет, есть вообще-то. Ладно. В меньшинстве там, нет, в минорстве. Ух, я сам-то затарен, я сам занят. Нечестно. То есть
The ability that I already wanted to add was a way to not fall to your death if you made a misstep. Basically a mulligan on movement. My thought is that if the player has the ability available when they would fall, instead flight is automatically activated for a few seconds, allowing them to get back to a still standing floor tile. This required adding a new check when the game would set the player's state to fall. Currently, if the player is not over a floor tile, adding a new check when the game would set the player's state to fall. Currently, if the player is not over a floor tile, a short counter begins. When the counter hits 0, the player falls. This allows a little leeway for the player if they're just slightly off of the tile and need to get back. So I just needed to add another check to see if flight is available before I set the player's state to fall. For testing, I added a green player outline to show when flight is activated. I also added a flashing effect that triggers right before the flight is about to run out, so the player has a clear indication of when it's ending. Once it ends, if the player is still not on the ground, the fall buffer counts again, and falling happens as normal. With the ability in and working, now I have to figure out how to turn it on. To encourage combat, I tied the special ability to killing enemies. I added a placeholder energy bar that will fill up as enemies are destroyed. Everything was going great until once again the curse that is the enemies in this project decided that I was just making far too much progress. If you remember from the last two videos, the enemies just don't want to work. To be more accurate, the way I wrote them just doesn't always work correctly. This is also around the time that my competition stopped by to spy on my progress. Hi Yannick, thank you for the follow. After futzing around with the enemies for a good bit, I couldn't solve the issue where sometimes they just won't die. But it really only seems to be happening when there are several of them all clumped up together. So as usual, I made it future me's problem and I moved on. My hope was to add a few more abilities, so I opened up ideas to my Twitch chat. I got a lot of great suggestions and sadly had to turn down some good ones because it would require rewriting some core mechanics for the game. For example, there were a lot of suggestions that involved bringing floor tiles back after they've fallen. But
это делать? Шаг за шагом, смотри, здесь лестница. Крайне звено, ты говоришь, попал. Ладно, все, спасибо. Закончил. Ушел. Не, пока лучше не рисковать, наверное. Не рискни-ка, беру, если
Unfortunately, the way I've set up the tiles in this game, when they fall, they actually destroy themselves. I already knew that future me was going to have a lot of issues dealing with the enemies and getting all that figured out, so changing the way a core mechanic works at this stage I felt was going to cause far too many problems. When dealing with game jams and short time limits, that just has to be considered, cause getting all that figured out, so changing the way a core mechanic works at this stage I felt was going to cause far too many problems. When dealing with game jams and short time limits, that just has to be considered, and I've already pushed my luck in the last 2 rounds. So sometimes good ideas need to be shelved because they just won't fit at this moment. We eventually decided on adding a decoy ability to make the enemies not target the player. Think alluring skulls in Dark Souls. I created a placeholder sprite with some particles to test it out. Next, I have to change the way the enemies target. Normally they are idle until the player gets within a certain range. Then, if they move, they switch to chase mode, where they move towards the player's position. I created a new variable to keep track of how many decoys the player has created. If the enemy is in chase mode and this variable is higher than 0, then the enemy's target is switched to the nearest decoy. Once the timer on the decoy runs out, it subtracts from the variable until there are no decoys left out and the variable is set to 0. At that point, the enemy's target changes back to the player. With the 2 new abilities working, I jumped over to Photoshop to figure out the art and UI. My original plan for the flying ability was to have the player glow and sparkle or something like that. Then someone in my chat suggested wings, and I thought that was a great idea. I began to make some big angel-like wings, but before I got too far into it, my wife, who is known as Lady Lark, had the idea that bat wings would be easier to draw and fit better aesthetically. And we have a saying in my Twitch chat, that Lady Lark is always right and has all the best ideas. So of course I had to try it out, and of course it looked great. I created some animation frames for the wings flapping, but unfortunately they were kind of in the wrong angle. As you can see, these wings would work great if we were on a side-on perspective like a platform, but in this top-down perspective, it's just not quite right. However, I was out of time on the stream, so I just threw the art in anyway just to see how it feels. And aside from the fact that they're flapping in the wrong direction, it looked great and it shouldn't take me too long to fix. The next day, I got back to work on the art. I fixed the wings and created more visually appealing progress bar for it. I wanted to match the heart UI that was already in the game, and I think it came out pretty well. I added the fixed animations and new UI to the game, as well as some particle effects to really sell that the player has been saved by the wings. Great, with that in, now I need to figure out what I'm going to make this decoy look like. I went back and forth for a little while, and I eventually settled on just making a circle with the player's eyes in it, and it ended up looking super cute. It also makes a lot of sense for a decoy, since it looks like the player. I added the new art to the game, and used the same UI concepts I used for the crystal shard, an image of the decoy with a number next to it letting you know how many you have. If you currently don't have any decoys, the UI hides itself. And that's where I had to call it on day 2. As usual, there's always one day in these challenges where I don't get any work done. Day 3 was that for me. My final day to work on the game, and it's actually in a pretty good state. The new required mechanic of special ability is in, working, and has art. I'd hoped to add more to the game, more abilities, more levels, etc. But looking at the time, I realized that was a one-way ticket to screwing everything up with hastily implemented ideas. This is the last round, which means at the end I want to have the best complete game package that I can. Meaning there's a lot of polish to add to bring everything together. I started by giving a lighting effect to the players and objects, which just adds a bit more atmosphere. I've actually wanted to do this since round 1, and just never found the time in the last 2 rounds. I threw in a tooltip to the decoy UI so the player knows which button to push.
Петрович, нет, Петров. Ну почти что, да. Ну видишь, самое лучшее не умеет. Ну больно, приятно, да. Как хорошо, что вы... искать надо вообще-то, да. Бомжом скоро бомжары станут за вас уже. Себя что ли. Нет, ну понятно, деньги которые конкурируют друг с другом. И есть для меня, то есть не для вас. Цель другая просто. Вообще, да. Ну да, да. Аппарат слабый был, аппарат. Все, я банкрот уже, в этом месте я уже все, банкрот, все, у меня уже все. Что вот эти, как где, вот эти заходят, где, ну давай. Что имеет в виду о себе? родишь, потому что у тебя нет физиологии женской. Воспитывать их не надо, это вредно, они уже сами себе пример показывает. Опять, ну а как вот, что значит пример показывает? Просто быть хорошим другом. Не понимаю. Ну пусть так будет. Кутенка, что ли, все ребенка даже не рожал. Ну да, поплатишься. Да. Вот и все. Я боюсь этой жизни, этого мира, еще что-то в этом духе, да. Ты ближе к психиатру. А потом сейчас ложишь на ребенка своего. Я просто понял. Того, конечно, хорошо это будет. Ну, все на здоровье, это изгибли успешно просто. Это говорю просто как да. Там не знаю, да. Это некрасиво просто, это некрасиво, просто это уродски как-то, да. Ему право, педагогику, ты ему даешь насилие совершаешь, то есть по всем наукам ты проиграл уже, да. Ну, это по всем проиграл. Специальность, детей ты имеешь в виду свои, это мама. А ты, например, пока ты отец просто. Потому что ты кабель, который дома отличается, потому что там ты, да. Да. Кстати, так и есть. Ты погрешишь просто и будешь пузатым уродом. Да. Будешь бороться с болезнями, с последствиями обмана. Да. То есть будешь вот эти козни уже будут. Понимаешь, он, короче, да. Я тебе говорю, поэтому я так и раздражаю, когда видел. Курю, не курю, да блин, ты жить-то зачем-то будешь или нет? Да, то есть, а потом уже будешь думать, так курить или не курить вообще там. Временем распоряжаться, когда зачем-то живи, а потом уже... С ума сойти, это же видно, люди, депрессия, не могу времени восстановить. Ей оно не нужно, Леш, зачем вся своя жизнь не нужна, оказывается. Женщина умирает, потом ты такой, вроде не очень жалко, потому что, Как кто должен быть, добро? Да, это тоже правильно. Тоже правильно, да. Золотаню. Я. Каная. Есть другая тематическая структура. Но функционирован. Вместе ходить. Покидалась уже, покидалась. Бухгалтерин. Давай, до свидания. Бухгалтерин, давай. Такие люди и без этого самая штучка. Facebook, говори нормально мне. Иш. Давай, до свидания. Молодец. Совсем круглый. Скажем. Вот видишь, может быть прав. Вот, да, да. Совсем идиот уже стал.
Have you ever wondered how it's possible to scratch a CD or a DVD and still have it play back whatever it's storing? The scratch really does affect the ones and zeros on the disk, so it reads off different data from what was stored, but unless it's really scratched up, the bits that it reads off are decoded into precisely the same file that was encoded onto it, a bit-for-bit copy, despite all of those errors. There is a whole pile of mathematical cleverness that allows us to store data, and just as importantly, to transmit data, in a way that's resilient to errors. Well, okay, actually it doesn't take that much cleverness to come up with a way to do this. Any file, whether it's a video or sound or text, some code, an image, whatever, is ultimately some sequence of ones and zeros. And a simple strategy to correct any bit that gets flipped would be to store 3 copies of each bit. Then the machine reading this file could compare these 3 copies and always take the best 2 out of 3 whenever there's a discrepancy. But what that means is using 2/3 of your space for redundancy. And even then, for all of that space given up, there's no strong guarantee about what happens if more than one bit gets flipped. The much more interesting question is how to make it so that errors can be corrected while giving up as little space as possible. For example, using the method that you'll learn about this video, you could store your data in 256-bit blocks, where each block uses 9 bits, 9, to act as a kind of redundancy, and the other 247 bits are free to carry whatever meaningful message or data that you want. And it will still be the case that if any bit gets flipped here, just by looking at this block and nothing more, a machine will be able to identify that there was an error and precisely where it was so that it knows how to correct it. And honestly, that that feels like magic. And for this particular scheme, if 2 bits get flipped, the machine will at least be able to detect that there were 2 errors, though it won't know how to fix them. We'll talk a little bit later about how this scales for blocks with different sizes. Methods that let you correct errors like this are known, reasonably enough, as error correction codes. For the better part of the last century, this field has been a really rich source of surprisingly deep math that gets incorporated into devices we use every day. The goal here is to give you a very thorough understanding of one of the earliest examples, known as a Hamming code. And by the way I'm thinking about the structure of this video is less about explaining it as directly as possible, and more a matter of prompting you to invent it for yourself, with a little gentle guidance here and there. So when you feel like you see where it's going at some point, take that moment to pause, actively predict what the scheme is going to be before I tell you. Also, if you want your understanding to get down to the hardware level, Ben Eder has made a video in conjunction with this one showing you how to actually implement Hamming codes on breadboards, which is extremely satisfying. Now, you should know, Hamming codes are not as widely used as more modern codes, like the Reed-Solomon algorithm, but there is a certain magic to the contrast between just how impossible this task feels at the start, and how utterly reasonable it seems once you learn about Hamming. The basic principle of error correction is that in a vast space of all possible messages, only some subset are going to be considered valid messages. As an analogy, think about correctly spelled words versus incorrectly spelled words. Whenever a valid message gets altered, the receiver is responsible for correcting what they see back to the nearest valid neighbor, as you might do with a typo. Coming up with a concrete algorithm to efficiently categorize messages like this, though, takes a certain cleverness. The story begins in the 1940s, when a young Richard Hamming was working for Bell Labs, and some of his work involved using a very big, expensive punch card computer that he had only limited access to. And the programs he kept putting through it kept failing, because every now and then a bit would get misread. Frustration being the crucible of invention, he got so fed up that he invented the world's first error correction code. There are many different ways to frame Hamming codes, but as a first pass, we're going to go through it the way that Hamming himself thought about them. Let's use an example that's simple, but not too simple. A block of 16 bits. We'll number the positions of these bits from 0 up to 15. The actual data that we want to store is only going to make up 12 of these bits, while 4 of the positions are going to be reserved as a kind of redundancy. The word redundant here doesn't simply mean copy. After all, those 4 bits don't give us enough room to blindly copy the data. Instead, they'll need to be a much more nuanced and clever kind of redundancy, not adding any new information, but adding resilience. You might expect these 4 special bits to come nicely packaged together, maybe at the end or something like that, but as you'll see, having them sit in positions which are powers of 2 allows for something but not too simple, a block of 16 bits. We'll number the positions of these bits from 0 up to 15. The actual data that we want to store is only going to make up 12 of these bits, while 4 of the positions are going to be reserved as a kind of redundancy. The word redundant here doesn't simply mean copy. After all, those 4 bits don't give us enough room to blindly copy the data. Instead, they'll need to be a much more
to use it. It's a small thing, but I think it's helpful for the decoy to do this since round 1 and just never found the push to use it. It's a small thing, but I think tooltip to the decoy UI so the player knows which button to push to use it. It's a small thing, but I think it's helpful for abilities that are not used as often as other ones. And now the point that I dread in every project. I'm now future me. The enemies need to be figured out, I've got to fix them, and I've got to make them work. Again, this has been a common trend through this whole competition. It's the last day, let's spend several hours rewriting the enemy AI. But this time, I recently found a YouTuber named BliskinX that makes devlogs and tutorials. They have a construct tutorial series that's just fantastic, and I've learned so much from it. They also do Unity and Godot tutorials and have way too few subscribers, so please check them out. I definitely wouldn't have figured all this out without those tutorials. So I used a lot of what I learned from their enemy AI episode and applied it to my enemies. There was still a fair amount of tweaking to get everything working, but in the end, they finally started acting the way I expected them to. And as an extra bonus, I still had a few hours left before I needed to submit, which is great because I still wanted to fix up the boss a little bit. In round 2, the boss was a bit of a joke, especially if you picked up a bunch of damage ups. By the way, I also nerfed damage ups. Instead of giving you a +1, they give you a +0.5. I removed the ability to stun the boss, and I enclosed the arena a little bit more. Once you enter, a wall appears behind you, locking you in. The boss no longer just follows the player either. It will for a time, but every so often it will choose a different direction to move in and fire. This creates a less predictable pattern that's harder for the player to anticipate. The boss is still fairly easy, and a decoy will distract him just fine, but I do think this is much better than round 2. I quickly updated the You Win screen to better show the number of shards the player has collected. I feel like this is something that wasn't emphasized before because the text was all the same color. Alright, it's 10 PM at this point, and there's only a handful of things left to do. It's at this point that I started to kind of panic at the fact that I wasn't really panicking yet, but I ignored that feeling and I pushed on. There's currently no way to obtain decoys other than my debug key, so I really needed to fix that. Instead of making them an ability like I thought I would, I figured the best implementation was to make them a shop item. So now at the start of each level, the player has a choice to purchase a health up, a damage up, or a couple decoys. I also raised the price of everything a little bit and then went through each level adding more shards that the player can collect. I chose not to add any more levels as I felt the time was better used to fix up the current ones and make them as fun as possible. I then added sound effects for the new elements and added a couple new music tracks, one for the boss room and one for the menu. And as I was updating the how to play image, I realized, holy crap, I still have time to playtest. I wasn't able to do that the last 2 rounds. And considering this is the last one, it really needed it. I did find a few bugs that I wouldn't have found if I hadn't had that time, so that's awesome. I uploaded the game to itch and I posted my link to Discord. Then I sat back and I kind of felt like I forgot something because the last half hour was a bit stressful, but it was nothing compared to rounds 1 and 2. I did later find a couple of audio bugs, but really nothing major. I guess I'm just so conditioned to be stressed out at the end that if I'm not, something feels wrong. In the end, I'm really pleased with the final result. I love the movement in this game, and now all of the elements help to emphasize that. The player has a choice to make if they want to go for a high score or spend their shards on power-ups to make the game easier. They also have the option to fight and build up a second chance to help save them in the future if they need it. It's been a lot of fun to watch this game evolve. It started as a fun movement mechanic with a bad power-up system and poor level design. Now it's effectively a top-down shooter platform. Seriously, if you think about the dash as a jump, it kind of works. I think it's a lot of fun to play, and the only thing I feel that's still missing is a speedrun timer and permanently keeping track of your highest score, both of which I hope to add in the near future. Until then, this game is available to play on my itch page if you'd like to check it out. This video is coming out a bit late because I had some computer issues, so a lot of you already know the final results of the jam, since Yannick's video came out a couple weeks ago. But if you don't know, the winner of the Ultimate Game Jam Season 1 is... Wait, it's me? I'm not gonna lie here, I was totally shocked when I saw that. I guess the focus on creating a final put-together game really paid off. I'd like to say thank you to the hosts and judges, Metabulous and Zyger, for organizing this whole thing. It was a lot of fun and I really enjoyed it. To Yannick, it was a great competition. Your game is awesome and you pushed me to make Tread Carefully the best game I could. If you haven't played Road Break, I would highly recommend it. He's already updated the game after the jam and it's fantastic. Also, check out Yannick's devlog to see his perspective on the jam. And with that, we bring the Ultimate Game Jam to a close. I had a lot of fun, a lot of stress, and came out with a really fun game. What more can you really ask for? Thank you all very much for watching, I really do appreciate it. And a special thank you to my video producer tier patrons that are so generous in these crazy times. If you would like to see your name in a future video or game and want to see these videos before anyone else, the link is in the description. If you would like to get a hold of me, you can message me on Twitter, talk to me during my live streams, or better yet, join the Discord with me and a bunch of other really cool people. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more in the future, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will talk with you next time. Have a good one. Later.
En analysant les parcours des entrepreneurs qui semblent réussir, on cherche à les imiter. On fait l'erreur de ne pas analyser tous les autres qui ont suivi la même stratégie, mais qui n'ont jamais eu de résultat. De la même manière, et plus particulièrement dans le domaine du business, comme celui du survivant, empêche des personnes de
Не
réussir.
рассчитано время, я из принципа, смотри, то есть у меня не рассчитано время на то, чтобы учить языки сейчас специально. То есть у меня нету сейчас никакого вообще резона. Ну я когда чуть-чуть занимался, да, то есть, ну понимаешь, короче, то есть зачем, с какого это, ну понимаешь, то есть, да. Нет, если надо будет, на цели, то понятно, да. То есть сейчас меня даже во Францию не берут. Я туда собирался сделать, что
Hey,
я сказал.
how's it going?
Я
This is
думал, ну какая нафиг разница? Да, я туда собирался просто, да. Ну да, я понял просто. Ну типа там, как бы, да, когда подходишь, как бы, бла-бла-бла. Да. Ну это ничего, так, там просто, я же не знаю, там, я понимаю, там тебя просто, да. Короче, да, не важно, то есть надо учиться еще, я тебя понял, да. Нет, это не так, как бы тебе сказать, это не так сложно, не так проблематично, как тебе кажется, да. Ну просто ты не с той стороны язык учишь просто, да. То есть его учить не надо, как бы, это тоже банально звучит, я не знаю, как это объяснить. Да, короче, надо просто жить, короче, типа того, дела делать, деньги зарабатывать, работать, да. Тебе все, кто угодно так скажет, он тебя понимает. Ну и параллельно, как бы, да, чуркой не быть, перед чуркой быть просто, да, я понял, ну это тоже, да. Я так говорю. Ну нет, это ну ладно. Понимаешь, ты такой, ой, такой язык, такой, ты такая, как девка-нимфетка, такой, ой, я такой язык учу, такой язык, ты посмотри, кому это надо. То есть, будь профессионалом тогда, да, то есть, ну, не знаю, деньги зарабатывать, значит. Надо, деньги жить, значит, деньги жить надо, да, отдельное действие, оно никогда, то есть, это бред, понимаешь, он просто. У тебя нету лишней жизни, чтобы вот, если не быть беременной, типа, женщины, да, чтобы ее провести как бы средненько, скажем так. Никуда, просто так отправить. Еще из нас, понимаете. Любви все отдано, любви, да. И заботе, да. Нет, если мужик, если я начинаю о ком-то заботиться, я болеть начинаю. Да. Ну, женщина это другая тема, ты ее любишь, она пьедестал какой-то, да, но там особо тогда ты не поделаешь, потому что если ты, да, понимаешь, да. Ну, женщина от этих тем хороша, то есть она пьедестал, пока она не начинает о деньгах, там, пока не начинает думать, пока не начинает о деньгах думать, или там, то есть, в квадрате, значит, пока, да, то есть она понимает. Пока она женщина, да, типа того. Когда если я женщина, то значит уже как бы да, он понимает. Ну да, хороша, ну понятно. Ладно. Понимаешь? Да, действительно. Что там? Короче, вот я просто по работе надо.
It's a jam I did a little while
Нет,
ago.
мне сейчас ничего не, мне сейчас надо по работе, типа того. Даже, ну, ты думаешь, репертуар концертмейстерский, я думал, мне надо руки иметь. Все-таки это и то, и туда, и сюда. Ну, я понимаю, что там тоже, да, я понимаю. Да. Я понимаю тебя просто. Ну да, как не выглядит, да, понимаю. Да. Теория, ну, типа того. У меня есть азы. Ну ладно, это не важно, не понимаешь специально.
But due to some technical issues, I haven't gotten around to making a video about it yet. But it is one I wanted to talk about because it made me think differently about making games. Personally, I'm a fan of tough games. I grew up in the NES and SNES eras, so my formative game playing years were spent repeatedly throwing my characters at what seemed like impossible challenges, with the ultimate fear of the dreaded game over. So in my mind, when I think of video game, I go back to what I grew up with. Difficult dexterity-based challenges with a stiff punishment for failure. I know that's not a correct definition, and video games are way more than that. But it is the first place that my brain goes to because of my experiences when I hear the term video game. And this is completely apparent if you look at the first game I ever made and posted online. The player is required to make precise jumps with an ever-oppressive countdown. I personally still think it's a lot of fun, but it is also very hard for a lot of players. Since making Don't Explode, I've made a lot more games, and for the most part, I've consciously tried to make them a lot less challenging. So, when the 8 Bits to Infinity community announced the Easy Jam, I thought, I got this, I know how to make games easy. Then I read the requirements and realized that I've never actually made a game that was that easy. Now, everyone's going to have a different interpretation of what easy actually means. So for the purpose of this jam, these are the guidelines we need to use. You don't have to do all of these, but these are to push you in the
Да.
in the right direction of what an easy game is for this jam. I could probably get away with doing my usual type of game where if you die, you just go back to where you fell or something like that. I decided I wanted to try something different and see if I could make a game with no fail or lose state, since I've never actually done that before. On top of that, the 8 Bits to Infinity jams are always two parts, a restriction and a theme. In this case, the restriction is the easy part, which we just talked about, and the theme is no enemies, which fits in pretty well. Alright, so I need to make a game that the player can't fail with no enemies. Let's dig in. It's a little embarrassing, but I literally start off by immediately forgetting the theme and focusing on the easy part only. Seriously, I don't know how it happened, but the idea I came up with was to make a clicker-style game where enemies would move towards the player and the player would have to shoot them. If the player didn't shoot the enemy, they would auto-die when they got too close, and the player would receive a higher score the further away the enemy was when they died. For example, if the enemy died 500 pixels away from the player, then the player would get 500 points added to their score. If they died 50 pixels away, they would get that instead. So completely oblivious to my flub, I set up the player and enemies. Everything was going great. I had the enemies in, and I was trying to figure out what art theme to use and what to make the enemies actually look like. That's when someone in my Twitch chat asked what the theme was for the jam, and my palm met my face pretty fast. It's really hard to do a theme with no enemies when you're designing a game all around. Enemies. But I thought about it for a little while, and luckily I was able to pretty quickly change tactics, and instead of enemies that attack a player, what if they're targets that the player has to shoot? I was thinking about the games you see at carnivals where you have the little BB gun and you have to shoot the targets as they move around. I figured that would probably work pretty well, so no more enemies attacking the player. I already had the spawning, health, and movement mechanics created for the enemies, and luckily I was able to keep pretty much everything. I just had to change the movement a little bit, and permanently lock the health to 1. Instead of moving toward the player, the former enemies, now targets, will just fall straight down and be destroyed when they hit the bottom of the play area, instead of going straight to the player. Definitely not my finest moment, but I managed to not waste too much of the work I had already done. The next day, I jumped back in with both feet, and this time I planned to actually follow the rules. I found a color palette that I liked, and set out to figure out some of the look for the game. This is my usual process: build the barest of working prototypes as a proof of concept, and then create some of the key art assets. This lets me more easily see what the end result could look like. I created the falling targets and thought it would be super cute to have them falling down on undersized parachute.
Хорошо, это нехорошо. Да, уже нехорошо, значит, это все, да. Быть головожопым, головобранцем, головохитрым. Ну вас. Так, стоп. Нет, уже все это сохранилось, себе он так думает просто. Кому-то надо, да. Ну вот нет, еще одну надо, вот это он говорит, выкладывай туда и все, значит, да. Ну вот это есть на самом деле, да. это есть, да. А, ну да, да. Вот, вдохновенно, да. Вот нет, наоборот, тогда тебе вообще ничего не надо по телефону, да, получается так, да. Это вот так думал, да. Да. Думаешь, стоит пробовать, наоборот? Ну да, ну потом, то есть как бы понятно все, да. Ну, это может пригодиться этой версии, да. Не совсем так.
And after playing with some sizing and shading, I had a large and small target that I thought looked pretty good. I added them to the game, and to give them a little more pizzazz, I added a particle effect that spawns when the target is destroyed. The particles are just made from a sliver of the target, rotated in 4 different directions. And I have to say, they made shooting the targets feel way more satisfying. I also did a test where I...
You also made test, right? Штучки. Круглозавр.
Up the spawn, and after playing with some sizing and shading, I had a large and small target that I thought looked pretty good. I added them to the game, and to give them a little more pizzazz, I added a particle effect that spawns when the target is destroyed. The particles are just made from a sliver of the target, rotated in 4 different directions. And I have to say, they made shooting the targets feel way more satisfying. I also did a test where I upped the spawn rates of the targets. I made them fall a lot more frequently. Turned out it actually made it a lot more fun, so I kept it. Now, if all you could do was click and shoot the targets, that would get a bit old pretty fast. My first thought was to add upgrades that could be purchased from a shop. So I added in a shop area and tried out the idea of additional auto-firing guns that the player could purchase and then place in the playfield. I also created a new shooting cursor, and probably the best placeholder art for a hand you have ever seen. Its glory is so great that my Twitch chat has built a cult around it that still thrives to this day. As for the auto-fire shop items, I just didn't like the way they worked. My thought was that I could have them shoot in different directions, and you would buy them and place them, but ultimately it was just kind of lackluster, and they didn't feel fun or exciting enough for me to keep spending time on. So, as usual, it became FutureMe's problem.
Ну вот это единственное самое. Это понятно, да, да. Хорошо, я понял. Все-таки я попробую. Да. шумел. Ой, друзья. Книга «Люди». Ну ладно. В обработке. Ленинград.
I set the shop aside for a moment and decided I wanted power-ups. Can you tell yet that I didn't have a great plan for this game? This is something I need to, and I've been trying to work on, as I usually tend to get a vague idea of the game I want to make, and then I just start adding
Да наоборот, да наоборот, он тебя бесит, ты его бесишь, да.
pieces in hopes that at the end I can form it all together into something cohesive. I'm trying to get better about that, but for better or worse, this was my approach here. So if the power-ups aren't going to be part of the shop, how do you get them? Golden targets, of course. Every now and then a golden target will fall with the rest. When it's destroyed, the player will get one of several buff effects for a short period. I added 4 effects: fast bullets, wobble bullets, piercing bullets, and everybody's favorite, big bullets. And yes, they can stack. To keep up with the trend on working on random stuff and just adding it in when I think about it, I next added in indicators that show the score the target gives you when it's destroyed. I also renamed score to tickets to better fit the Carnival arcade theme, as well as to add a cumulative ticket count. This way I could have an end count that the player is striving for, as well as allowing the player to spend the tickets they have collected in the shop, once Future Me gets the shop working. Since Cookie Clicker was one of the main inspirations for this game, I originally planned that you would just go as long as you wanted, but after thinking about it, I realized I wasn't going to be able to make enough content to make that fun for very long. And I figured a large number like 1 million tickets would be a pretty good goal. I know most players won't actually make it to 1 million tickets and finish the game, but for those that do play longer, having the game end before it becomes extra monotonous is something I do like. Great, a couple days in and I finally have a plan, but I'm still far from done. The shop has been Future Me's problem for a little while now, and it's that fateful time in every jam where the two of us become one. I didn't like my initial idea of picking up other guns and placing them down so they'll fire for you. So for the shop, I decided it would probably be better to have items that you just clicked and they would destroy a large amount of targets. No complicated pick up and place in a certain area or location or anything else that could get complicated. I started with a saw that moves back and forth horizontally across the screen, shredding any target that's in its way. And they're really fun and satisfying when you see them just mowing through targets. When you purchase the saw, it will randomly spawn at different heights across the screen, so you can have multiple going at once. I dug in to make some art for the saws, and they ended up looking a lot more like shuriken than saws, but I'm okay with that. Later that night, I added a bomb shop item as well. When you purchase it, it destroys all targets on the screen. Once again, distracted by shiny objects, I then added a multiplier box that pops up randomly. Think golden cookie and cookie clicker. If the player clicks it, then they get a permanent ticket multiplier. This is another item that I added to make sure the game doesn't take forever to get to the end and become too boring. Because once you get above 100,000 tickets, the score really slows down. So these permanent multipliers are a huge help.
You might have seen videos like this before, but here's the big secret. Anyone can make one of these videos in a few minutes. You might think you need a professional animator or to learn some fancy...
Big challenge. You're so big and so challenge. Challenge yourself. Нет, наоборот. Негациант. Вы куда пойдете? Да, дорога, я понял, ребят. Нет. Ну да, это не жизнь хороша, это у нас популяция недоумков, это мы недоумки просто все. То есть как бы есть вариант, да, имеешь право жить с улучшением, короче, и знать про это, да. Ну нет, как бы это уже специально так просто говорить, специально вранье просто, потому что не надо ничего туда, наверное, как-то так, наверное. Женщина тебя сюда впаяет, как бы, ты будешь тянуть. И мотыкуйся вместе с нами, понимаю, там где-то. И так, и не так, понимаете. Ну да, свободный радикальный элемент, но это тоже так классно, да, в меру, наверное, ладно, да. Вот для этого любовь и дана, наверное, не разбогнуть чего не надо. Она самая может быть, да. Ну как бы, как, что ты хочешь сказать? Я тебе просто факт говорю, что мужик всегда свободен. То есть, как бы, если ты будешь думать, что мужик, да, можешь за это либо поплатиться, либо стать свиньей. Понимаешь? Смотри сама, что лучше. Да. Но если стать свиньей, это значит счастье. Да, да понимаете. Идиллия. Желательно бездетно. Ограниченное, да. Ну, чтобы нахрюкивать, понимаете. Ну, понимаешь. Да. Нормальный мужик не будет себя заставить, как бы пропускная способность. Или может с малого даже начать. У кого какие критерии? Я лично не знаю. Но все равно деньги нужны. Да, то есть, это понятно, что деньги. Да. Наверное, ладно, вы понимаете. Да. Труд всего мира ты за него должен как бы. Да. Сказал. Глаза. Сон. Я же еще не выпустил даже. Не выпустил еще. Тебя не выпустил. Там смотрит там. Ух ты, дед тебя. А что там их так много? Удаляй тогда его. на сядь. Ну и ты сядь, заметь. Можно я там посмотрю до тебя. Кстати, это он видел, не знаю, да, не смотри игру, не говорит, ты играйте, играй в игру, что там, это, да, союз, вот это, да, файл. Эй, где он? Зачем ты не показываешь ты его, блин? Зачем он это делает? Тихо молчи, блин. Внимание теперь или нет? Хочешь сказать, что все 60 они вот так вот быстро заряжаются, что ли? Конечно, нет. Ты правильно понимаешь. Вредина это просто сильно. Дэви Шмо. Мавитон. Кидать это мавитон, понимаешь? Ну да. Вот, а ты тоже будешь понимать, что ты уже знаешь. Впереди ты.
Привет! Добро пожаловать на канал Geekbrains. В этом выпуске речь пойдет о еще одной актуальной IT-профессии – горазработчик. Итак, поехали. В середине 2000-х в
Number the positions of these bits from 0 up to 15. The actual data that we want to store.
Пока лица книг, книга лиц есть. Нет, разрешение нельзя, надо говорить, как так? Из этой штучки, что ли? Загрузка там, что ли, изучать? Там этих видосов, как ешкины эти штучки. Ладно. Нажимаю. Здорово, друзья. Ты так думаешь? Ради себя. Все. Я. теперь было, пора было. Молодые, сам да. И что туда записать, что ли? Типа там это самое, коктейль, да, надо иметь наоборот, ну нет. Понял, в чем с Фейсбуком-то что проблема? Почему? Или у меня там уже есть акт, наверное, да? Чё проблема? Почему?